Alice lives her quiet life, but is taken to the Duke's palace, and they say that she is now the double of the future Empress. And when they are heading to the groom's palace, their carriage is attacked, and Alice must save Helen at the cost of her life in order to prevent her mother from dying. Not long before this, the guy, who was all covered in blood, sat in a dark dungeon. He no longer had the strength to endure all this. His tears ran out because he had been crying for a very long time. His hands were cuffed in special handcuffs so that he could not escape. The guy was completely desperate, so he closed his eyes, and Lyoka fell onto the cold ground. And after that, with a heavy soul, he fell asleep. The interrogations and torture continued for several days, and he no longer had the strength to endure it all. The man himself understood that even if he had survived, he would only have brought shame to his family, which is why he wanted to die. He understood perfectly well that even if he could somehow miraculously get out of that terrible place, no one would take him back. So the man hoped that one day he would be beaten to death and he would not have to endure it any longer. He was ready to beg for at least someone to kill him, because the man no longer saw any meaning in his life. And then one day, a rather small but incredibly beautiful girl came into his prison cell. She came closer to him and suddenly touched his head and began to whisper something. The guy immediately felt better at that moment, and he thought that a real miracle had happened, which he had no longer hoped for. After some time, the girl took her hands off him, and he felt much better. He sat down in the middle of the cell. I don't understand what happened at all. Even strength appeared in his hands, and life energy spread throughout his body. The girl then turned to him with her beautiful, gentle, and affectionate voice and said that now everything was fine. The guy still couldn't believe what had happened. He looked at his hands and now felt like a different person. And the girl, holding out her hand to him to help him stand up, told him to go with her out of that terrible place. It was this lady who became his hope. She saved him, and he could not believe that he had such luck after so much time of suffering. And the moment this girl appeared, he finally found a purpose in his life again. He wanted to see her again one day. He knew perfectly well that this was a completely reckless desire, since this girl was the only daughter of his sworn enemy. Several years have passed since then, and this beautiful girl with fiery red hair was called Alicia. It was she who, back then, as a teenager, was able to save this unfortunate guy, and after so many years, she appeared at the Vikerous castle. As soon as she looked at the front door, she immediately froze in place. This made her nervous and trembling, but she was quite a brave girl. One man, who was accompanying her, told her not to linger and to follow him closely without moving away even a step. Alicia immediately went after him. In fact, she never thought that she would have to return to that place. The girl walked through the castle with her head down because it brought back unpleasant memories, and she didn't want to have anything to do with that horrible family anymore. Her dear mother, who had the name Rosen, was forced to become the most unhappy woman in the village. And even though Rosen had her beloved fiancé, Duke Vicruz became interested in her, and, despite everything, simply made her his woman. Naturally, the Duke's family refused to accept her because she was a very ordinary person, a pawn in their game, and did not have any high status. And after Rosen gave birth to her dear and only daughter Alicia, she was simply kicked out of the house. She had no choice but to simply return to her hometown with a small child in her arms. However, when Rosen did this, the townspeople avoided her and called her a girl of easy virtue. They condemned her for all her actions and could not take her back. But nevertheless, she was lucky, and there were some kind people who were able to support them and take them in. One of them was her ex-fiancé, Uncle Peter, and a few years later, when Alicia grew up, he really admired her beauty. Not a single day went by without him complimenting her on how beautiful and wonderful she was. Of course, the girls were very pleased, because it was the man who, together with her mother's ex-fiancé, took them back. He was a minor uncle, and he also owned his own pharmacy. When Alicia grew up, she always helped him. The man returned from the market and brought new herbs for his recipes. Smiling happily at the girl, he asked if it was true that she was already 20, and he also said that this was a very good age. Well, Uncle Miner never tired of reminding the girl that it was time for her to start looking for a groom. But Alicia deftly dodged this conversation and said that she simply didn't have time for all this. Eventually, this uncle taught her not only about medicinal herbs, but also taught her all the intricacies of running a business. He was one of the first to insist that a girl should look for a worthy partner and said that you can never know for sure when you will meet your soulmate. Alicia often agreed with him, but said that until her mother got better, she didn't even dare to think about it. The girl understood perfectly well that she was in the greatest debt to her mother, since she had gone through many difficulties in order to raise her and not lose heart. After a short silence, Uncle Miner turned to her and asked what she thought about his son, Tom. He also said that he turned the same age as her that year, and if she was interested in him, the man could facilitate their personal meeting. Alicia, of course, was amazed when she heard this, and the man asked if it was true that she had known Tom since he was a little girl. It seemed to him that they had always gotten along well. Miner also replied that he was also very worried about poor Rosen. He always pestered his father and said that as soon as he could invent a cure for her illness, the first thing he would do would be to give it to them. Quite often, I watched this girl and how she worried about her mother, and his heart simply broke into small pieces when he saw how they suffered. The uncle said he just thought that maybe it would be a lot easier for the two of them to take care of her mother and run the store. But when he asked what Alicia herself thought about it, the girl did not answer right away, because Tom was like a younger brother to her. She never considered him in a romantic way. However, at that moment, she remembered the words of her mother, who said that her dream before her death was that she wanted to see Alicia in a wedding dress. Of course, these words stuck in the girl's head for a long time, and she didn't want to let down her dear mother, who really didn't have much time left. So, sighing heavily, the girl turned to her uncle and said that she really appreciated his concern and thoughts about her future. She didn't refuse him, but she didn't agree either. Alicia simply said that she would like to first discuss this issue with her mother and then give a final answer. After this conversation, Alice went into the forest with her herbs. She thought that it was not the right time to think about such things. However, considering her mother's condition, it was a really good offer, so she was confused. The girl realized that if she married Tom, their financial situation would become much more stable. And besides, taking care of her mother would have been much easier and more effective, so the girl did not know what to do. After some time, she finally went to the house where her mother lived and brought her new herbs to ease her pain and suffering. However, when Alicia approached the door, she heard a loud scream from her mother, who was telling them to leave her house immediately. Alicia stopped near the entrance. She immediately became worried, not understanding who it could be, because no one was supposed to come that day. The girl was about to enter when she suddenly heard her mother screaming that her daughter was not there. Of course, as soon as she heard about this, she realized that they were talking about her, but she became even more wary because she had never heard such an angry voice from her mother. Alicia panicked a little and began to slowly move back, but accidentally stepped on a branch, causing a lot of noise. That very moment, the door of her mother's house opened, and the fair-haired guy grabbed Alicia by the hand so that she wouldn't fall. He looked her straight in the eyes and asked if it was true that she was the girl named Alicia. Without waiting for an answer, he immediately said that the Duke of Vicruz was looking for her personally, and he had come to bring her to him. The girl was shocked, however, when she saw that the other knights grabbed her mother, who was all in tears, and did not let her leave. She became very scared. Rosen was screaming very loudly at that moment. She was telling Alice not to go and to run away from there as soon as she could. However, the man who held her hand told her to behave quietly. You see, it was also for her mother's sake, so it was better for her not to resist if she did not want bad consequences for herself. In fact, the Duchy of Vecrus was the most prestigious noble family in the Tyron Empire and had an impeccable household. In this whole hierarchy, the Duke was at the very top of aristocratic society and was indeed a very respected man. The Duchess, in turn, ran the household with absolute power and could do whatever her heart desired, and their beloved and only daughter completed this whole picture with her spoiled nature. However, this ideal family had one very major flaw, and it was, of course, Alice and her mother. The girls became a huge stain on the reputation of this impeccable family, as there were constant rumors about an illegitimate wife and daughter. And it was for this reason that the girl was called straight to that castle. When they went inside, one of the knights who accompanied her told his grace that he had brought Alicia. The girl herself was serious. In fact, She could not believe that she had returned to a place that was filled with treacherous nobles. In the living room, Alice immediately saw Helena Vickers, who was the Duke's daughter. Of course, her father stood next to her, and her dear mother Alicia could not believe that she had gone to the place where her beloved mother's life was destroyed forever. As soon as the girl entered, she immediately asked what business they all had with her, and for what reason they so unceremoniously took her to that estate. Helen, sipping her tea, immediately said that even ordinary people should have known how to greet people who were higher in status than them, and the girl was very alarmed by the fact that she did not observe these norms. Helen turned to her father, and calling Alicia a creature, said that she certainly did not expect manners from her. The girl's mother immediately laughed loudly and said that there was no need for perfection, because after all, this girl was just their disposable pawn, whom they were going to get rid of soon. As soon as Alicia heard this, she immediately panicked a little. She didn't understand what this could mean and why these people invited her. However, at that moment, the Duke began to quickly approach her and said that she would like not to waste their time, but to get straight to the point. When he got as close to Alice as possible, he said that the Adrian family proposed an alliance through a marriage contract, and the Duke, whose name was Spencer, said that even an ordinary commoner like a girl should have heard their name somewhere. And Alicia really heard. As soon as she heard about Adrian, she immediately remembered that it was one of the two great noble families in the Empire of Tyron, on par, even with Vicus. It was a distinguished family known for its contribution to the founding of the empire and its loyalty to the emperor. Therefore, the girl did not understand at all why the marriage was proposed. Because they had been at odds for generations, their families were really feuding. And Spencer said that Alicia was supposed to go to the Adrian family. The girl, hearing this, of course, was indignant and began to ask the Duke why exactly she, because she was the most ordinary inhabitant of the village, unremarkable in any way. However, the man looked at her with a rather stern look and said that she had to go there on behalf of the Viceroy's daughter. He explained that the girl was now a replacement for Helena, so it was not discussed. Alicia was shocked. She couldn't believe that they actually told her such a thing and forced her to do it. The girl was incredibly shocked. She looked at Helen, who was pretty with herself, and couldn't believe that she was supposed to be that girl's understudy. Spencer said that there were forces that were against the alliance between Vicus and Adrian, and so they received information that they were planning to kill Helen. So he said that they were going to let them believe that they had succeeded, only to, instead of their triumph, simply go and destroy these people. Of course, they were not going to sacrifice their own daughter, and it was for this reason that they decided to find a replacement for her, so that Alice would now be in her place. The girl began to get very nervous. She asked if they really thought that Duke Adrian would fall for such a trick. She believed that he would never have believed that she was Helen. He would have instantly seen the truth and realized that she was a commoner, and that he had been deceived. Well, the man tried to calm her down and said that there was no need to worry because he was aware of their plan, so nothing bad should happen. Alicia was very surprised to hear this, but she understood that her life meant nothing to them, and that was the reason they were sending her to certain death. At that moment, she clenched her hand into a fist and thought that the nobles really were the worst people in the world, since they allowed themselves to do something like that. After a short silence, the girl said that she refused this offer and under no circumstances intended to participate in this whole adventure. Alicia began to scream loudly and said that she did not want to agree with the proposal, which was essentially a death sentence. It was too cruel even for the Duke. She said that she was already engaged and her mother was sick, so she needed her help, so of course Alice couldn't go anywhere. But at the moment the girl said this phrase, Helen and her mother immediately laughed loudly. The Duke himself was quite calm, but even a little angry. He looked at her with a rather stern look and said that this was indeed all funny, but it was not a request, but an order, and was not subject to discussion. He smiled and said that he could have wiped off the face of the earth, the place she called home, right then and there, and the remaining days of his frail mother would have been shortened even more. The man also replied that perhaps he should have even tried her mother as a witch. Then she would have received an even harsher sentence than one could have imagined. When Alicia heard this, she got angry. She immediately screamed and said that of course she didn't agree to this. She didn't understand how they could even say such a thing about a person they once loved. As soon as the Duke's wife heard this, she became very indignant and stood up from her seat. But the girl continued to say that her mother was not his slave, and he had no right to treat them the way he wanted. Of course, the Duchess was tired of listening to all this. When she approached Alice, she swung her arm and hit her very hard on the cheek. After that, she began to return to her place, saying that the words of the dirty commoners were as dirty as their existence, so she could not stand it any longer, so she took certain measures to not listen anymore. The woman also said that it was all absolutely disgusting and she would never want to get involved with any commoners again because they were all terrible. Alicia didn't say a single word then. She held her swollen cheek from the blow and tried to hold back the tears that were welling up in her eyes. The Duke also stood for a while and simply remained silent. But after that, he said that he had one proposal for her in order to resolve the differences. Spencer said that if she agreed to the offer, he was willing to cover her mother's medical expenses, as well as provide the best royal doctors and the best medicines available. Alicia was shocked when she heard this. She couldn't believe that this could really happen. The offer was too tempting. Of course, the girl wanted to help her mother with all her might, so that she would recover quickly or at least not suffer. The man also said that her mother's life was now in her hands, and it was up to her decision whether the woman would die or not. He told her not to miss this wonderful opportunity, but to think it over carefully, after which the man let the girl go and said that she had some time to decide. So he said that in the end, Elena had to prepare to become empress, so she had a lot of worries. But the girl objected and said that there was nothing that could be done about it. The replacement prince was still too young, and therefore this decision no longer depended on them. At that moment, Spencer wrote a small note and tied it to the pigeon's leg and sent it. He was very glad that his plan was now in action because it meant that they had moved from dead center. Alicia, meanwhile, was already returning home. In fact, she had been thinking about the words the Duke had said all this time. He had asked her to bring him a satisfactory result, otherwise everything would have ended badly. And when the girl was walking through the forest, she suddenly heard a small rustle in the bushes. She immediately became interested, not understanding what it could be. But at that moment, the bushes opened up, and then she saw her dear mother, who looked very excited. Alice immediately ran up to her and asked what she was doing there anyway, so she grabbed her hand to help her stand still. Rose replied that she was very worried about being taken away, so she decided to check after that. She saw red on the girl's cheek and asked what happened to her. Where did she get this wound from? She immediately hugged her daughter and asked if it hurt. She said that she was very sorry that it happened and called her a poor girl. So she started asking her for forgiveness, saying that it was all her fault. But in fact, the woman didn't even have one shoe on. She was so worried and wanted to see her daughter. Of course, Alice understood that it was not her mother's fault at all. It was all that terrible family's fault. So she smiled and told her mother that everything was fine. Her small scratch should heal in no time. So everything was definitely fine, and she didn't feel any pain at all. Her mother was about to object, but Alicia began to take off her shoe and said that it must have hurt her too, because walking on the ground without shoes was unpleasant. She also said that the woman was not in good health, so she should not worry about her. She should worry about herself. The girl helped her put on the shoe and said that she wanted the woman to live a long life, and therefore she had to take care of herself. Alicia was no longer going to let her mother suffer any more than she already did, so the girl wanted to protect her no matter what it cost her. She was ready to do anything, and even if it meant making that deal and becoming an aristocrat, even though she didn't want it at all, Alicia was ready to do it for her mother. And so, a whole month passed from that moment. The man, who was in a knight's uniform, was deep in the forest carrying out his mission. One of the assistants who was trying to catch up with him ran up to him and asked the man to stay for a while because he needed to tell him something. The guy asked the man why he was in such a hurry, since it was completely impossible to keep up with him. The black-haired knight immediately stopped and told the queue that he was simply too slow and therefore could not keep up with him. This man was the head of the ducal house of Hadrian, but the empire was a tyrant, and his name was Karl Hadrian Karlord. Key, adjusting his bow, immediately said that he did not understand why their Adrian family needed to unite with their enemies. He said that they were very vain and arrogant people with whom they had nothing in common, so he considered it a very stupid and ill-considered union. But Carl didn't listen to him. He walked far ahead and didn't even intend to stop. The guy was very upset and asked if they could slow down their pace a little, because he was already tired of this fast walking. However, at that moment, the man was actually very happy about what was about to happen. He even anticipated this union, since very soon his heart was about to beat again. He remembered when he was still a teenager and how the girl saved him, so that very soon he would see her again and experience the same unimaginable feelings as then. He also wondered if only a woman could remember him, since so many years had passed and they had changed. But hope remained in his soul. When the assistant finally caught up with the guy, he said that there was no way that Lady Vicruz would have divine power, and there was no guarantee that her and His Excellency's child would be able to inherit it. In fact, the guy was talking about divine power. It was the ability to heal that was passed down only in the Vicruz family. It was an incredibly rare power that only appeared once in a generation and was therefore highly prized, and some people even desired to obtain it. Long ago, a rich daughter saved the first emperor with her divine power and eventually became the empress. From that time on, the Vicus family constantly gave to the empress, monopolizing influence as relatives of the emperor, and thus earned themselves a lot of money and status. However, calm waters eventually freeze, so the emperor eventually became just a puppet, and the victorious family sank into corruption. Now some time had passed since then, and their family had more power than even the emperor and the crown prince, which of course did not have the best effect on everyone else. However, there was one family that opposed the victorious. It was the largest faction that supported the crown prince. And this family was the Adrian family, including Karl himself. And it was for this reason that this marriage was of decisive importance. Breaking the connection between Victorious and the imperial family was incredibly important, so the man simply had to take this step. At least that was the official reason why the man married this girl. However, Karl began to wonder why there were rumors that she did not have divine power, because he clearly remembered how she used it that day and helped him. He assumed that most likely it was a special precaution, since she was the only bearer of divine power in the Victorious family, and therefore it was necessary to hide this information. An assistant approached him and said that the elders' opinions were divided, and asked whether the man remembered this for sure, since it played an important role. He also said that they should have eradicated this family instead of offering the alliance. They should have gotten rid of it from the very beginning before they made such a stupid contract. Then Karl couldn't stand it. He turned to the man and asked if he even understood that this marriage was a step towards the fall of Victorious. The guy sighed heavily and said that it was certainly true, but he still considered it suspicious that this family had agreed to the marriage so easily. He started to take out one of his arrows because he saw a small pigeon flying towards them and told the gentleman that the carrier pigeon had finally arrived. Karl immediately intercepted the arrow from him and, aiming his bow at the pigeon, said that he himself had seen it all perfectly well. At that very second, the arrow flew straight towards this innocent creature who carried a note on its paw. Of course, he found it rather suspicious to use a carrier pigeon for such an important task, so he thought they should have checked for any hidden dangers in it. Karl immediately went to the place where the dove was supposed to fall, but at that moment he stopped, and all because he heard the girl's voice, and after that, her silhouette. She took this unfortunate creature into her arms and said that he needed to be patient. There was not much longer left. She felt incredibly sorry for what had happened to this creature, and she wanted to somehow comfort and protect him. At that moment, Karl looked at the girl more closely and saw her red hair. He immediately recognized her and therefore could not say a single word. The girl herself at that moment felt like someone was looking at her and immediately turned her head to the side to see who it was. Karl, in turn, at that moment was absolutely sure that it was really her, and therefore his heart began to beat even faster. This girl was Alicia. She put the poor wounded dove aside and asked the knight if it was his catch. She came closer to him and asked for forgiveness, saying that she didn't want to touch him without permission. She just didn't expect that there was anyone nearby. But Karl immediately said that it didn't matter at all. The most important thing he wanted to find out was why the girl was in the middle of the forest, completely alone. Alice replied that her guards were nearby, but something else was more important to her. She began to take something out of her pocket, and, handing it to the man, said that of course he didn't need it, but she wanted to give it to him. Then the girl handed the man a small jar, and when he saw it, he immediately realized that it was a jar of ointment. The guy was very surprised, and the girl, pointing to some parts of her face, said that this was for the injury that he could have developed. The man was about to say something, but Alicia turned around and started to leave, saying that she already had to run, and also asked him to take care of himself. After this, the girl left, leaving the man completely confused, alone. He really did not understand what had happened and did not know how to react to it. However, when he looked at this ointment again, he immediately smiled and thought that the girl had not changed at all since that time. This, of course, made him very happy, and having kissed this small jar of ointment, he immediately thought that he had finally been able to find it after so much time. However, after some time, the man showed up at the mansion and met directly with Helen. The girl sitting opposite him said that it was their first meeting and she was very happy to meet them. She also gave her name so that he knew how to address her. But as soon as Carl heard that this was their first meeting, and as soon as he saw this girl, he was immediately very surprised. He understood that this was not the lady he had met in the forest, but this woman was Helen Victorious. But this fact upset him very much, because the girl he crossed paths with in the forest had the same red hair and green eyes that were the defining features of the Victorious family. And this fact made him very wary. He thought about who that woman could be, and decided that he absolutely had to find out about it. Helen turned to the man and said that she had arranged for him to replace her before the wedding. Carl, upon hearing about this substitute, was immediately surprised and said that he had never heard anything like it before, so he asked what she meant. Helen immediately explained that there were factions that opposed their alliance and wanted her dead, so her father secretly arranged and prepared a special replacement for her. With a very sad expression on her face, Helen said that it was certainly incredibly difficult for her to sacrifice a completely different person, but it was simply necessary. She explained that they could not miss this opportunity and not destroy their enemies, so it was a necessary measure that she simply could not refuse. Carl sat, not showing any emotion on his face. He didn't understand how this could have happened. It was too cruel. However, in any case, he also understood the fact that as soon as the wedding was over, they would get rid of the impostor, because he was dangerous to their reputation. Carl couldn't believe that she was so different from the kind girl he knew, so it was hard for him to take in all this information. However, he couldn't quickly give up on the fact that this girl had saved him, and so he had to be grateful that they were able to meet again, so the man threw all these suspicions aside. But at that moment, someone knocked on their door, and Helen immediately said that it was her replacement who had arrived, so she asked him to let her introduce her. Then, the very same girl whom Carl had met in the forest entered the room, and Helen pointed in her direction and said that this very girl was her deputy. When Alicia looked up and saw this man, whom she had accidentally met in the forest, she was very surprised. Carl himself was amazed, because he recognized this girl and was now completely confused. He looked at her without looking away, and could not believe that this girl was now Helen's replacement. The Duke's daughter herself came closer to Alice and said that she was simply a resident of the Vicris territory. This girl was promised sufficient compensation in exchange for the work of her replacement, so the man could rest assured that she would do a good job of her role. But at that moment, Carl suddenly covered his head with his hand. He was confused and very nervous. Helen immediately noticed this and realized that this was not very good, so she had to somehow calm him down. Waving her hand towards Alicia, she asked her to leave the room because she needed to talk alone, and the girl immediately did so. When they were alone, Helen approached Carl and suddenly sat down on her knees in front of him, which greatly surprised the man. He was about to get up and move away from her, and also asked what she was doing, but he didn't have time to say anything else. The girl took his hand and said that she had always dreamed of being with dear Lord Carl. And looking straight into his eyes, she said that no matter what, they had to get to the wedding day safely so that everything would go smoothly and according to plan. In that case, they could live happily together when all these misunderstandings would end. So she really hoped for his support and help. Carl didn't understand what was happening at all, and why everything happened exactly like this. In front of him was the lady, Helen, who saved him, so he didn't understand how he could even think about another woman. The man reproached himself very much because all his thoughts were about that mysterious girl whom he had met in the forest and who was now a replacement for Helen. He thought that the victorious family had only one daughter, and it was she who saved him, so he had to be grateful to this girl who sat in front of him. So at that moment, the man got down on one knee and kissed Helen on the hand and said that he was ready to protect her, using absolutely everything he had, and no matter what it cost him. And if we were to think about Carl, he finally managed to get to her, so he should have appreciated what he had and not thought about anything else. Meanwhile, Alice stood outside the door and thought that Helen's fiancé was the man she had met by chance in the forest. But she didn't understand why, in that case, he looked at her in such a way, as if he longed for her with all his soul. The girl assumed that he was simply surprised that he had accidentally met not her, but the person who was now her replacement, and he simply thought then that it was her. But Alice also assumed that he could simply mistake her for someone else, but she quickly discarded this option because the man turned out to be too serious for that. Some time passed from that moment, and suddenly, a fair-haired guy approached the girl. He called her his lady and extended his hand forward. The man explained that he had to escort her to her new room, so he asked her to follow him. This man was a member of the Order of the Knight of Winning, and his name was Chase, and it was exactly the same man who brought her to that estate, so the girl was even a little uneasy about it. Alice immediately agreed and went after him without any problems. But in fact, she could not avoid him because he was now her personal knight. So she just hoped that this was someone she could just talk to without any judgment or anything. Chase suddenly turned to her when they went outside and asked what she was doing in the forest earlier. The girl was a little surprised by such an unexpected question, but said that she saw a bird that was shot, so she just wanted to make sure that everything was okay with it. But the man said that she had to be always on alert. You could never know for sure when or where someone might try to harm his lady, and it was for this reason that the man now had to be with her constantly in order to protect her. If anything happened, the girl sighed heavily and said that she was now perfectly aware of this. However, he suddenly said that she had absolutely no reason to worry, because he really saw how upset she was. The man smiled and said that if anything happened, he and the rest of the victorious knights would be able to protect her so that she would not have to be afraid. Alicia was very surprised to hear this, because she did not expect that he could be much nicer and friendlier than she thought, but it was really so. Then they moved on, and Chase said that one day she had to leave this castle and therefore had to be extra vigilant and always concerned about her well-being and safety. Alice immediately asked if he was saying this because enemies could hide and pretend to be anyone in order to harm her. The man said that of course it was the same, but it would now be quite difficult for her to adapt to a new place and constantly play another person, so she should never forget her real role. Some time had passed since then, and she was already sitting in a carriage on the way to her new place of residence. Now that she was in the carriage, she understood what the man had meant when he said that it would be difficult for her, because the carriage shook terribly on that crooked mountain path. Of course, she could get used to living in the village, but now everything was different, and as soon as she looked at Helen, who was riding with her, she saw that she was clearly not at ease. After that, the girl looked out the window and thought that it was clearly not the right time to worry about someone else, because this was the girl who offered her as her replacement so that he would not die. So Alice understood how wrong it would be to worry about her so much. When she looked out the window, she saw that Carl was accompanying their carriage right next to her. She was a little surprised, but after looking more closely, she wondered if everything was okay with him, because she remembered how bad the injury was on his face and hoped that the ointment helped him. At that moment, Carl seemed to feel that someone was watching him and turned his head to the side. Their gazes intersected. Because of this, Ellie felt a little uncomfortable and embarrassed. She immediately closed the curtain on the window and looked away from him. She didn't want their eyes to meet because she knew it was too awkward and she couldn't stand it. Helen noticed her at that moment and immediately realized that something was wrong. Then the girl, smiling broadly, turned to Alice and said that she had been yearning for someone else's fiancé, and that was why she was exactly like her mother and not far from her. Alice, hearing this, of course, objected. She began to scream and told the girl that this was not at all what she thought. Well, Helen continued to insist on her own and said that she was very sorry because this man had proposed to her many years ago, and a person like her certainly could not please him. That's why she told Alice with complete confidence that she couldn't even hope for anything there. He definitely couldn't love a commoner like her. The girl was very outraged by this conversation. She turned away from her and said that she had constantly told her that this was not it at all. She was not interested in this man at all, and she did not want to take anyone away. But soon she realized that it was completely useless to argue, since the girl still continued to insist on her own. Then Helen suddenly moved closer to her and, looking into her eyes, asked if she really thought that she could take her place. Pulling the curtains even closer so that nothing could be seen from the window, she told Alice not to run ahead and not to be so confident in herself. The girl said with absolute confidence that she was ready to check how well Alice understood this information, and for this, she was even ready to take cruel measures. After some time, they decided to stop for a while and rest, and Helen picked up a bottle of wine that she had taken with her and began to unceremoniously pour it right on Alice's head. Of course, Alice was very surprised when she felt this, because she had just sat down to have a quiet lunch, and for some time she was simply in a stupor. Helen then smiled happily and said that this was the best wine she had ever seen in her life, so she advised Alice not to waste such a chance, but to simply drink it from her hair. She told the girl that she would never have such a chance to try it again, but of course Alice did not listen to her. The girl insert your place started to leave and said that she wanted to spend the night alone and not see them anymore, so she just left. Helen was not surprised at all. She just smiled happily because she had managed to somehow undermine Alice's self-confidence and ruin the rest of her day. But when Alice went outside, she thought that she certainly wasn't going to let this girl stoop to such a level and make such mockery again. As long as she could cure her mother's illness, she could endure absolutely everything and tolerate it, so she didn't even intend to show Helen that she was somehow offended or unpleasant. When Alice walked forward, she was so deeply immersed in her thoughts that she didn't even notice how Carl appeared right in front of her. She stopped in front of him, and for a while they just looked silently into each other's eyes. But Alice quickly remembered. With her manners, she immediately bowed and said that the young lady was dining inside the tent at that time, so he could find her there. But then the girl suddenly remembered the wine that she was covered in and immediately felt very awkward. She explained to the man that she had accidentally spilled wine while eating, and also added that this definitely should not happen again. She did not want to spoil the product. But Carl said that she didn't need to explain all this. The girl was genuinely surprised to hear this and immediately looked at him. And the guy explained that it had absolutely nothing to do with her, so he didn't even want to know anything about it. She had to live her own separate life and not involve him in anything. Alice was of course surprised, but she immediately asked for forgiveness and bowed again. Carl, without even listening to her apology, simply began to leave without saying a word. Then the girl turned and looked after him. She immediately thought about the fact that this man was now behaving completely differently than when they met in the forest. Of course, this made her wary, because then he was quite friendly and even looked at her differently. But now everything was different, and Alice thought that it was because she was a commoner and he found out about it. And this meant that, in the end, he was just a nobleman like everyone else, very arrogant and selfish. This whole situation made Alice very angry, and she thought that those two were really good for each other. So it was not for nothing that they decided to start a family. Who is it that Carl has already come to the tent? He closed the curtain behind him and did not understand what had happened at all. Of course he was interested in what happened to that poor girl and why she was covered in wine. He really wanted to find out more about this situation. At that moment, as the man entered the tent, Keelan immediately addressed him. She came closer to him and looked very worried. The girl looked at him with a pitiful look and asked if everything was okay with him, because he didn't immediately hear when she started calling him and only noticed her after some time. The man immediately said that he was fine. Then Helene replied that the road was very uneven because of the mountains and asked if it was true that he was very tired because of this. The man didn't respond to this. He thought again that she was saying completely unnecessary things, so he didn't understand why it was necessary to continue this dialogue further. But the man pulled Helen closer to him and said that he was not tired at all. This road had not tired him out one bit. He looked the girl straight in the eyes and said that compared to what he had to do to meet her in person, this journey was absolutely nothing. The girl, hearing this, immediately giggled, looked into his eyes for a while, and then hugged him quite tightly. So she said that right now she was incredibly happy. She was glad to hear that he was all right, and that he was not hurt or tired anywhere, and also that he was glad to be with her. And so, several hours passed from that moment. It was already completely dark outside, and in the meantime, Alice was in the forest near a small stream. Alice took some water in her hands and washed her face in order to refresh it, and also to remove all the wine that was still left. The girl immediately felt much better and fresher, and she liked it. However, at that moment, Chase, who had been standing nearby the whole time, suddenly approached her and asked if she had finished yet. The girl, who thought she had been alone all this time, was very surprised to see him, and asked since when he had been around. The man smiled and said that he had been there from the moment she ran to the riverbank. After all, it was his duty, so he had no right to leave her alone. Alicia immediately started wiping her face and said that she didn't notice it at all, and it was really very surprising. But then the girl thought about it and realized that this meant that he saw her covered in wine, and because of this, she felt even more awkward because she realized how stupid she looked. However, at that moment, they heard a loud cry coming from the line of knights who were lined up and awaiting further orders. One of the leaders of the knights turned to them and said that this was the camp of the Order of Hadrian because the color of the tents was different, and they should have known this. Then Chase moved closer to the girl and told her to also look in the other direction, namely at the flag that was on top. There was a coat of arms depicted there, and he said that it was the coat of arms of the family of Hadrian, and the duke who ruled their family at that time was also known as the young lion of their family. And it was for this reason that the flag had such a color after the war with Kellen 2 years ago. He won this honorable status and did not show that he did not deserve it. At that time, their country was suffering greatly from a lack of troops, but thanks to the leadership of the young duke, they were able to achieve a wonderful victory, and thus he showed that he was capable of more. Alice then replied that she had heard some rumors that had been going around about it, but since he was a war hero, she had expected him to be larger and even stronger. But in the end, when the girl saw him in person, her impressions turned out to be untrue, and he looked completely different. Chase immediately explained that it was all because of his outward appearance as a soldier that he was initially underestimated, but in reality, he was actually incredibly stronger than he looked. However, with his leadership on the battlefield and brilliant strategies, he was now highly respected even more than anyone else, and many knights were honored to fight alongside this man. Alice, hearing this, was very amazed. He impressed her even more than she thought. She did not expect that this man could have such a great and luxurious reputation. However, at that moment, she thought carefully about Chase's words and immediately turned to him because she had some doubts. The girl said that despite the fact that he was a knight of Vikras, it seemed to her that he had a positive opinion of Duke Adrian, so she asked what this was connected with. The man had fully expected such a question, so he calmly replied that the opinion of the Adrian family did not interest him. But the girl still didn't understand this. She said that by saying such things, she wasn't sure that everything could be okay, and asked if he really thought so. Chase didn't understand what she was even talking about, so he looked at her in surprise for a while. Well, after that, the man laughed loudly and sat down next to her on the ground. He said that the fact that she was there meant that she was excluded from the race for the inheritance. He asked her if she thought so, and when the girl said that theoretically it was possible, he continued. The man said he was the third son of a count, a nobleman in name only, who inherited only a small portion of the wealth. What he thought or felt was of absolutely no interest to anyone. He was a distant player in their chess game. Alice was very surprised when he said these words, and immediately wondered if his other brothers and sisters were supposed to inherit something more worthwhile. The man immediately said that this was indeed the case, since they were older than him, and should have received titles and various territories. For this reason, until he tried to show himself as a true knight and earned his own land, he was no different from a rich commoner. I sighed heavily in honor, and also said that his father had abandoned him long ago, so he had absolutely no one who would be on his side. The girl, hearing this, was amazed, because even his father could not accept it properly, and she thought that their situations were somewhat similar, so she felt a certain closeness to him in an instant. After a short silence, Alice looked at the river and, sighing heavily, said that this was very unfair. But Cheese touched the water and said that she shouldn't worry about it at all, because if anything, he was even glad that he managed to break all ties, because he didn't want to be associated with those people. He put his hand forward and said that he knew perfectly well that he was the one who got her into this, but he thought that they were in the same boat, so they should stick together. Alice actually thought the same, and then the man smiled and replied that it was for this very reason that he was going to protect her at any cost, since he considered it his duty. The girls were very pleased to hear these words, and she told Chase that she had just a great idea of how they could solve this situation. She looked the man straight in the eye and said that she too could protect herself, and therefore asked him to teach her how to do it correctly. The girl believed that this would be the most suitable option for her. Smiling happily, Alice said that she was ready to try her best to learn some martial art so that she could stand up for herself if necessary. Chase was genuinely surprised when he heard this, but he didn't agree. He hung his head down and said that all this was simply impossible. Pod explained that it would be much more effective to protect her as a knight, and she didn't need to learn martial arts at all. The man also said that the people who were supposed to attack her with murderous intent were much stronger than she could have ever expected. For this reason, he categorically refused to allow the girl to study and defend herself independently. Then Alice couldn't stand it any longer and asked if Helen wasn't supposed to be their priority when the time came. She would have to protect herself, and in any case, the knights might not be around, and she would have to do something. The girl really believed that the best option for herself was to be able to stand up for her life. She did not want to die and had to return home to her mother alive and well. Chase listened to her carefully, sighing heavily. He said that he understood her concerns perfectly well, but he would never allow anything bad to happen to her. He would rather risk his life than have her die. And it was for this reason that he asked her to give up the idea of defending herself. Training and real combat were completely different concepts, and when some time had passed since that moment, they set off again after a night break. Alice sat opposite Helen, and all this time thought about the situation and the conversation that took place at night. She had absolutely no idea what he meant when he said that these were completely different things. She assumed that he simply didn't want to try to work on it, so that's why he told her so. The girl also thought that when she returned to her village, she would be the strongest and would be able to resist anyone. However, at that moment, she was interrupted from her thoughts by Helen's voice, who told the girl to sit correctly because she was doing it incorrectly. She told Alice that her clothes were untidy, so she had to fix them and always take care of her appearance. Helen explained that she was not going to allow her name to be disgraced, so she had to supervise every single detail. Alice understood that it was easier to agree than to argue, so, adjusting her clothes, she thought that the heavy dress and huge hat only caused her more discomfort. The girl couldn't breathe normally even in that outfit, let alone move. She even thought that if something bad had happened at that moment, she would have definitely died because she wouldn't have been able to even just run away. And as soon as Alice thought about this, the carriage suddenly stopped very abruptly. The girls immediately became worried because no more stops were predicted. Helen quickly looked out the window, not understanding what it was, what just happened, and why they were shaking so much. But Alice also looked out the window and immediately began to reach out to the girl, saying that there was danger there. She tried to grab her hand, but it was too late. And all because right next to them, there was a huge explosion, and it pushed the carriage. Helen began to fall into an open quarry and could not grab onto anything. Alice tried to grab her hand and pull her closer to her, but it was too hard. But when the girls finally managed to do it, she turned Helene over onto her stomach, covered her head with her hands, and the two of them fell into the gorge, and Alice took a significant blow. After some time, the girl finally got to her feet, and when she looked up, she saw a lot of people who were armed and very hostile. Looking more closely, Alice saw that their carriage had been captured by these knights, who were shouting that it was the Nekrasov's carriage and that they had to take everything that was there from them. There were already many different pieces of jewelry lying on the ground, which the hooligans were just about to take. Alice immediately realized that they were bandits. She ran up to Lady Helen and asked if she was okay, because they needed to get away from there immediately. The girl herself began to cough very hard. She hit Alice on the hand so that she would not touch her and asked her if she was really that stupid. Artika's daughter looked at her with a disapproving look and said that she was now Helena, so she shouldn't have addressed her like that. Then the hooligans had already turned their attention to the gorge, but they also saw that the Vikra's daughter was there, so they were ready to start hunting for the girls. Alice immediately apologized to the girl, said that she had completely forgotten that she was supposed to play this role, and also said that in any case, they needed to run away immediately. And just as she was about to do this, Helen suddenly pushed her into the water with all her strength. The girl could not stay on her feet and fell. After that, she said that her job was to protect her, and that meant that the only person who was supposed to die in that place was not Helen, but Alice. At that very time, Chase was upstairs fighting off these hooligans, in order, of course, to protect his mistress, to whom he was now faithful. The man shouted, turning to the lady and asking if she could hear him. However, when Charles looked down, he saw that she did not react at all. No matter how much he screamed, she did not even look in his direction. Meanwhile, Alice finally got up from the lake and turned to Helen and asked what she had just done. The girl, meanwhile, had already begun to emerge from the water, completely ignoring her because she saw no point in that conversation. However, Alice shouted at her even louder and told her to tell her what she was even thinking and how dare she do this to her. Helen then looked at her with a tired look and said that the girl apparently still did not understand the situation she was now in. At that time, the hooligans had already begun to run up to them, slowly but surely, and the girl asked Alice to allow her to teach them in that case. And without waiting for any answer, she suddenly fell to the ground and began to address her, saying that it was she, Lady Helen, and also asked her to forget about a simple servant like her and just run away. Of course, Alice was shocked. She didn't understand what she was doing at all. The girl grabbed her hand and asked why she was doing this. But Helen continued to play her role. She turned to the lady and told her to let her go, because it was she who needed to be saved. At that very moment, one of the hooligans ran up to the girl and, grabbing her around the waist, shouted to the rest of his assistants. The man told them that he had caught the daughter of the virus, and that was why she was with him. The girl tried to escape, but it was all useless because this man was incredibly strong. Helen, meanwhile, simply stood up calmly from her seat and began to walk away with small steps, because now everyone thought that she was a simple servant. Chase, who was nearby, saw all this and immediately ran to his lady in order to save her. And just a few seconds later, he was next to Alice and stuck his sword into the back of the hooligan, who was going to take her away somewhere. Alice couldn't stay on her feet. She fell into the water again and just stayed there for a while. The girl tried to sit up, but began coughing very hard because she had swallowed water during the fall. The knight approached her and asked if everything was okay with her. As soon as the girl saw who saved her, she was amazed. Seeing Chase, she was very happy because she had already thought that no one could save her, and she herself could not protect herself. The man then extended his hand to help her stand up and asked if she was hurt anywhere. At that time, the other hooligans had already begun to attack. He said that there were too many enemies, so he told the girls to stay close to him and not move away even a step. Helen immediately grabbed her replacement by the waist and stood behind her. These people began to gradually approach and shouted that they should kill her and take her away. Of course, he wasn't going to give up without a fight. He went on the offensive first and killed the enemies one after another without even blinking an eye. The man managed to do this very easily. However, even despite this, he understood perfectly well that at such a pace and speed, the two girls had no chance of saving themselves. There were too many enemies, and he could not do anything about them. He was already thinking about what he should do. But at that moment, another person joined them and shouted loudly, addressing the hooligans and telling them to all get out of his way. After that, he saw a huge flame that flashed right in front of them. He covered the girls with his body and tried to limit their contact with the fire. A completely unfamiliar guy approached them. He had blonde hair and said that Chase was a lucky guy. He asked the man to calmly give them the woman, but if he began to resist, he would definitely die. As soon as the knight looked at this man, he immediately realized that he had used magic to destroy the carriage, and it was because of him that they had gotten into this situation. He immediately turned to the man and said that he wished it would never happen, so he could not even hope. The stranger continued to wave his sword, from which flames were visible, which meant that he was using magic, and the guy, looking at Chase, said that in that case, he was simply ready to kill him first, and then take what he needed. However, at that moment, the voice of another man was heard, and when Alice turned her head up, she saw the Duke, who was jumping on his end of the mountain and asking the hooligan who he was going to kill. The guy, as soon as he heard this voice, of course, immediately recognized it, and therefore became very wary and even somewhat scared. At that very moment, Carl landed opposite him and was ready to defend himself and also to kill. The guy, seeing him, was very scared. He didn't understand where he came from and didn't know how to resist him now. Carl at that moment took out his weapon and said that this type of attack would certainly not be able to scare him and would not work on him. He raised his sword up and thereby activated his magical abilities. Everything around was covered in blue flames, and it was a delightful sight. After that, Carl directed his energy straight at this hooligan, but he missed a little because he dodged his blow, while the other attackers began to run in different directions because they understood that life was more important to them. The guy, of course, also started to run away. He turned to everyone else and said that they had no more choice, and not everyone should retreat in order to at least slightly save themselves. Carl, meanwhile, approached Helen and immediately quickly examined her and said that she was not injured. He gently grabbed her by the waist and held her quite tightly so that she would not fall. The girl, seeing the man, immediately became happy. She said that she was very glad that he came to their aid and was able to drive away these hooligans, because she had already despaired. And Carl replied that he was very glad that she was safe, and they hugged and exchanged pleasantries for a while. Alice, meanwhile, stood to the side and simply watched all this, not understanding what was happening at all and why such a game was being played for the public. Carl glanced at her and then turned to Helen again and said that for her sake, he was ready to do anything. And at that moment, the girl realized what it meant to be a substitute. She was now always in Helen's shadow, but she was hers only when it was dangerous. To all these people, her life was absolutely nothing, and that meant she was on her own. At that moment, one of the hooligans shouted again and said that Nekrasov's daughter was still there, so they could continue attacking. Alice immediately turned around and started running away. She understood that this was necessary, but because she ran so fast, she dropped her boot in the water and didn't even notice it. The only person she could trust in that situation was herself, so the girl had to act seriously and quickly. Alice ran as fast as she could and thought that all these people were aristocrats, and not only were they really the worst in the world, the girl could not contain her emotions. She burst into tears, but did not stop running. At that moment, Charles, who was standing nearby, saw that the lady had started to run away. He already wanted to run after her, but he didn't have time because someone turned to him. This man was one of the knights. He asked Charles what he was doing and also told him not to break formation, because that was not right. They had to defeat the enemies. He was about to say something about Lady Helen, but the knight replied that he should leave her, because their master was the Duke and the girl who stood next to him, and not that substitute. He also said that if the guy understood everything, he should have immediately returned to the line and confronted Charles. He was confused. He did not know what to do. He really wanted to run after the girl and help her, but he realized that he had no choice. He just stood and looked for a while at the place where she ran. And at that moment, he remembered how he had sworn to her that he would always be there and protect her. But he also knew that he could not break all this and had to remain in the ranks in order to protect the Duke and his bride. The man was in despair. He wanted more than anything in the world to run after Alice, but he could not do it, and now the girl was left completely alone.